He laughed as he tightened the cuffs, thinking he'd just put another loudmouth in her place. But 5 minutes into court, she stood up, gave her full title, and pulled out the first of 10 witness reports with his name on it. What happens when the woman you arrested turns out to be the one investigating your badge? If that question hits you, go ahead and share your thoughts in the comments. We post stories like this every day, real powerful and true to life. So hit the like button, subscribe, and stay with us. Because what happens next will shake the courtroom, and maybe even you. It started with a quiet drive through Westlake. Late afternoon, early winter. The sky was clear, the air dry, and the sun was dipping just low enough to cast that long golden stretch across the road. Simone Harper had just finished a full day of depositions and internal briefings at the U.S. Attorney's Office. She was tired, thoughtful, and headed home. Her car, sleek charcoal black, polished like a courtroom shoe, glided past the rusted mailbox clusters and cracked sidewalks. It wasn't a flashy car, but it was expensive, and in this neighborhood, that mattered. She saw the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror before she heard the siren. She exhaled, slowly. Hands at 10 and 2. She pulled over. The officer approached, fast steps, square shoulders, mirrored sunglasses. White male, mid-40s, southern jawline, badge glinting under the fading light. License and registration, he said, voice tight like he was already in a fight. Simone responded evenly. Of course, officer. She handed them over, everything in order. Clean, crisp. He didn't even look at them before tossing out his next line. That's a fancy ride for someone like you. Her eyes stayed forward. Calm. Is there a reason I've been pulled over, officer? That question, so measured, so professional, hit him sideways. Most people, when they asked that, had a tremble in their voice. A flicker of panic. But not her. Her voice was steady, her body still, her tone surgical. He stared at her, chewing his bottom lip. I'll be asking the questions. Step out of the vehicle. She didn't move, just turned her head slightly toward him. My license is valid. My registration is up to date. I'd appreciate knowing what I'm being stopped for. That did it. His ego cracked. The tone in her voice, it wasn't fear and it wasn't defiance. It was something else. Something that made him feel challenged. You're being uncooperative, he snapped. She raised one brow. I've answered every request. I've done nothing wrong. Out of the car, now. Still composed, she stepped out. Tailored navy slacks, low heels, no makeup, no noise. She moved like she belonged in a place he didn't understand. He opened the back door of his cruiser and grabbed the cuffs. You're under arrest. For what? He didn't answer, just said turn around. And she did. But just before the metal touched her wrists, she said it soft, low, and cold. You just made this bigger than you realize. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. He paused for half a second, then clicked the cuffs shut anyway. He thought it was over. It hadn't even begun. The holding cell wasn't much, just 4 dull walls and a single bench bolted to the floor, but Simone Harper sat as if she were waiting for a car service, not locked up under fluorescent lights. She crossed her ankles neatly back, straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Nothing about her posture suggested fear or even irritation. She was composed, as if she had already factored this stop into her day. Outside the glass partition, Officer Cole Matthews couldn't stop glancing her way. There was something about the way she held herself, too still, too centered, that unsettled him. Most people in that chair were either loud pacing or slumped in resignation. But this woman, she looked like she'd been here before and not from the side of the accused. He turned toward the sound of footsteps and saw Officer Luis Vega approaching, holding a few printouts in his hand. Vega had been around long enough to recognize when something felt off, and today his instincts were quietly ringing. I ran her plates, Vega said, lowering his voice. Car's clean, no priors, no outstanding anything. She owns a house in Brentwood, paid in full, registered under her name. Cole took the papers without looking at him, so Vega shrugged lightly. So, she's a federal employee. Justice Department. That made Cole glance up. Doing what? Vega shook his head. Doesn't say. Just lists DOJ in a clearance level. Pretty high. Cole stared through the glass again, his jaw tightening. She hasn't said anything. That's what's making me nervous, Vega replied. She's not panicking. She's not asking for her lawyer. She's just waiting. Simone shifted slightly on the bench, her eyes moving not frantically but attentively. She had already mapped out the layout of the room, noted the cameras, the clock above the door that was 6 minutes fast, and the way Officer Matthews had gripped her ID like he was holding a lie he didn't want to face. And as she sat there in silence, her mind drifted not toward fear but memory. 10 years earlier, in a conference room far more polished but no less cold, she had sat across from a hiring panel. 3 white men in dark suits, a woman with glasses too small for her face, and a polite but rehearsed rejection. "We appreciate your application, Ms. Harper. You're highly qualified, but we're looking for someone who better aligns with the culture of our team." She had smiled, nodded, and walked out of the room with her head high and a wound so clean it didn't bleed until she was alone. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "If the doors don't open, I'll stop knocking." But she hadn't stopped. Instead, she had learned to carve her own path through systems that weren't built for her. She had moved steadily through the ranks, taken the cases no one wanted, and investigated the people no one else dared touch. All the while, she remained careful, never reckless, never loud. Until now. Back in the cell, she heard muffled voices behind the glass. Cole and Vega. Something in their tone shifted. She didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. They were starting to realize they didn't just detain someone, they had stepped into something bigger. Her thoughts returned to the file that still sat in her locked briefcase. It held internal complaints, disciplinary records, body cam transcripts, evidence of a disturbing pattern inside Crestwood PD, and the officer whose name appeared more than any other, Cole Matthews. She had been quietly building that file for months. She hadn't planned to confront him like this, not today, not like this. But sometimes life doesn't wait for the paperwork. She turned her gaze back to the reflection in the glass, locking eyes with Cole just for a second. His face was tense now, less sure. She wasn't angry, she wasn't smug, she was simply present. I didn't expect it to come to this, she thought. But maybe it was meant to. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens just before something changes. No one looked up when the door opened, at least not right away. But they did when they saw her. Simone Harper walked in slowly, confidently, like she belonged there. She wasn't in a jail uniform, no handcuffs, just a sharp navy blue suit, heels that didn't make a sound, and a leather case tucked under one arm. Her hair was tied back, her face calm. She didn't scan the room. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly where everyone was. Cole Matthews was seated off to the right, just behind the prosecution table. When he saw her, his eyebrows drew in. He leaned forward, slightly confused at first, then uncertain. This wasn't what he expected. The woman he arrested had been quiet, composed, but forgettable, or so he thought. The woman walking into court now looked like someone he would have taken orders from, and that thought made him shift in his seat. Judge Morrison looked up from the file in front of her. "Ms. Harper, do you have legal representation today?" Simone stepped forward. She opened her case, pulled out a single folder, and met the judge's eyes. With the court's permission, she said clearly, "I'll be representing myself." That drew a few glances across the room. A subtle ripple in the air. "I am a federal prosecutor," Simone continued, assigned to the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. "And I currently have an open investigation into Officer Cole Matthews and his conduct during traffic stops and related incidents." The silence that followed wasn't just surprise, it was a shift in weight. Like the ground had tilted just slightly, but enough for everyone to feel it. Even the judge sat back in her chair. "You're actively investigating the arresting officer in your own case." "Yes, Your Honor," Simone said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. This arrest falls within the scope of an ongoing inquiry involving patterns of misconduct in this department. Across the aisle, Cole's hands gripped the edge of his seat. He glanced at the assistant city attorney, hoping for some signal, some kind of objection or defense. But nothing came. The room was too still. The judge looked at Simone carefully. "This is unusual, Ms. Harper. Are you sure you want to proceed without outside counsel?" "I'm sure," Simone replied. "Given the circumstances, I believe it's best that I speak for myself." Cole opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. She hadn't looked at him until now. But then she did. Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. There was no anger in them, no triumph, no mockery, just truth. And that made it worse. It was the kind of look that said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" Not spoken, but heard loud enough to make him shift in his seat again. Simone turned back to the bench. "If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to begin by entering this into the record, my formal complaint filed 2 weeks ago against Officer Matthews regarding a series of traffic stops where his conduct raised legal and ethical concerns. Several of those stops involved black drivers who were searched or cited without clear cause. I have supporting documentation." She placed the folder on the desk before her, opened it, and slid one copy toward the clerk. Judge Morrison glanced at the file, her expression now serious. Cole didn't move. He couldn't. It was as if every assumption he'd made about that woman on the roadside was unraveling right in front of him, and he had no way to stop it. Simone didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had shifted the room without ever breaking pace, and now every eye was on her. And none were on him. Simone stood at the podium, papers organized neatly before her. She didn't rush. She didn't grandstand. She simply began to speak. Your Honor, she said calmly, what happened during my traffic stop wasn't an isolated incident. It follows a pattern, one that has gone unchecked for years in this very department. She glanced briefly at the judge, then down at her notes. Her tone remained measured, but behind every word was weight-controlled, precise and steady. I'd like to enter into the record Exhibit A. She continued, lifting a document. An incident from March of last year involving a 17-year-old black student named Jamal Reed. She paused as the clerk took the document. Mr. Reed was stopped by Officer Matthews while walking home from basketball practice. No weapon, no contraband, just a backpack and earbuds. According to the officer's report, Jamal was moving suspiciously through a residential area. Simone raised her eyes to meet the judge's again. By suspicious, he meant black. Wearing a hoodie, carrying textbooks. Jamal was detained, questioned, and frisked on camera. No cause, no apology. A low murmur stirred in the gallery. The judge lifted a hand, gently signaling silence, but she didn't interrupt Simone. Simone nodded once and moved to the next file. Exhibit B, Tanya Wallace, a mother of 3, pulled over by Officer Matthews for a non-functioning taillight. Surveillance footage shows her brake lights were working at the time of the stop. Simone flipped the folder open, showing a still image. What wasn't noted in the officer's report was that Ms. Wallace was threatened with arrest when she questioned why her license was being scanned. Her children, ages 5, 7, and 10, were in the back seat. She looked up. They cried the whole way home. Cole's face tensed. He shifted, jaw clenched, eyes down. This isn't just bad policing, Simone said quietly. She let the words breathe in the silence. It's a pattern. That was when the city prosecutor stood. A well-dressed man with salt and pepper hair and a polished voice that echoed a bit too well in the courtroom. Your Honor, he said, while Ms. Harper's testimony is compelling, we must be careful not to conflate personal grievances with legal procedure. She is the one who was arrested. She is the one bringing this case. With all due respect, what we're hearing sounds like a personal crusade, an attempt to undermine a single officer based on a handful of incidents taken out of context. He glanced toward the gallery, then back to the bench. We should remain focused on the specific facts of the arrest at hand. There was a pause. Simone didn't move. She didn't object. She simply turned her head and looked at him. Her gaze was cool, direct. No anger, no emotion on the surface, but it held something deeper. Then she spoke slow, clear, and unshaken. This isn't personal, it's structural. The words hung in the air. This isn't about Officer Matthews alone, she said. It's about what happens when a badge is used as a shield and silence becomes policy. I've spent years investigating civil rights violations across multiple jurisdictions. I've seen how isolated incidents, when left unchecked, become habits. Then habits become culture, and culture becomes a wall. She took a step closer to the jury box, speaking not just to the judge now, but to the room itself. I'm not here to relive my arrest. I'm here because what happened to me fits into something much bigger and far more dangerous. She gestured gently toward the evidence table. What you see here isn't revenge, it's a record, and it's long overdue. For a moment, no one said anything. The courtroom once again shifted, less visibly this time, but deeper. The tension had moved from drama to truth. Even Cole could feel it, the weight of it settling in his shoulders. Simone didn't gloat. She didn't press further. She simply stepped back, returned to her table, and sat down without a sound. And though nothing had exploded, something had cracked. The courtroom felt heavier that morning, not louder, just more aware. People didn't just come to watch. They came to listen. And that's when Nathan Breyer arrived. He walked in like he had been there 100 times, which in truth he had. A senior prosecutor, sharp-measured, always dressed like a man who didn't need to raise his voice to win. Gray suit, gray tie, gray eyes. Nothing flashy, nothing careless. He gave a polite nod to Judge Morrison and placed his case files on the table. Then turned to Simone with a familiar smile, one of those smiles that says, I know exactly what you're trying to do. Miss Harper, he said, smoothly. I didn't expect to find you here, on both sides of the aisle. Simone didn't flinch. You'll find I move between roles just fine. Breyer's smile stayed, but his tone shifted. He turned toward the judge. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to raise a concern. It speaks directly to the credibility of this proceeding and of the person at the center of it. Judge Morrison looked over her glasses. Go ahead, Mr. Breyer. He stepped forward slow and sure. As we've seen, Ms. Harper has positioned herself as a federal investigator, a complainant, and now her own legal representative. That's quite a lot of roles for one person in one courtroom. He let the words settle for just a moment. And while I don't doubt her sincerity, he added, I do question her objectivity, especially given her history. 3 years ago, she led the prosecution in People versus Mendoza, a case that resulted in a wrongful conviction. 14 months served before the defense uncovered withheld evidence Ms. Harper had access to. A quiet shift moved through the room. No gasps, just that subtle energy that says, this just got personal. Simone's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the desk. Not from shock, from memory. Breyer continued, mistakes happen. I know that, but this courtroom shouldn't become a platform for redemption. Justice isn't a second chance for prosecutors. It's a first chance for the truth. He gave a small nod toward the jury box, then stepped back, hands folded neatly. Silence. Simone stayed seated. For a moment, she didn't speak. She let herself feel it. Not the sting of accusation, she'd lived with that already, but the weight of the past pressing up through the floor of the present. She remembered the mother's voice. I thought you were the one who'd protect him. She remembered standing outside the courthouse alone, long after the news vans had left. Then slowly she stood. I did fail, she said. No defense, no spin, just the truth. I missed something that should have been caught. And because of that, someone lost more than a year of their life. I won't pretend that didn't shape me. She paused not for effect, but because she needed the breath. That's why I'm here now. Not to fix the past, but to make damn sure I don't let it repeat itself. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. She turned, slightly speaking, not just to the judge now, but to every eye watching her. I didn't come here to settle a score. I came here because silence has a cost. I've seen it, I've caused it, and I won't be part of it again. The room was still, but it wasn't cold. People leaned in not because they were curious, but because they believed her. Even Breyer looked quieter. Simone returned to her seat. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. In that moment, it was clear she wasn't perfect, but she was real, and that mattered more. The courthouse emptied out by early evening. The lights dimmed, the voices faded, and the day folded in on itself. But Simone didn't go straight home. She stayed late in her office alone, flipping through the same pages she'd read a dozen times already. She wasn't looking for new evidence, she was looking for clarity, for resolve. That night, her inbox chimed. At first, she ignored it. Another update from the field office, she thought, but the subject line froze her hand. Back off, or we bring him down too. She clicked it open. Drop it, or your brother's record goes public. We both know how messy that was. Walk away, Simone, while you still can. There was no name, just an attachment, a scanned copy of an old arrest report. One she hadn't seen in years. One she thought was buried for good. Her chest tightened, not from fear, from history. She leaned back slowly, letting the silence settle. Her eyes stayed on the screen, but her mind was already somewhere else, years back in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and sweat. Her brother Marcus had been barely 20. Wrong place, wrong time. He was charged in a robbery he didn't commit. The prosecution pushed hard. No one looked twice at the holes in the story. Simone had just started law school, too green to help, too proud to ask anyone else to. He served 4 years before the truth came out, and even then the record didn't fully clear. The stain never left her family. Her parents stopped trusting the system. Marcus stopped trusting her, and she'd never quite forgiven herself for that. Now someone wanted to use that pain to shut her down. She sat there a long while, didn't cry, didn't rage, just let it hurt the way old wounds do, quietly deep in the places that never fully healed. The next morning, she met with an old colleague, Daniel Liu. They'd worked together on federal cases years ago. He knew her rhythm, her sense of justice, and her stubborn streak. He listened without interrupting, then leaned forward. Whoever sent that knows how to hit you, he said. Simone nodded. It worked. For a minute. You thinking of backing down? She looked at him, eyes steady but tired. If I stay silent again, what kind of prosecutor am I? Daniel didn't answer right away. Then he just said, the kind that's already made up her mind. Later that afternoon, Simone walked into the courtroom holding a sealed envelope. She handed it directly to the judge's clerk, then addressed the bench. Your Honor, I've received a threatening communication in relation to this case. The contents are personal in nature, but the intention is clear to pressure me into withdrawal by targeting my family. The judge raised an eyebrow. Do you know who sent it? Not yet, Simone replied, but I've turned it over to federal investigators. She straightened her shoulders. I'm also submitting it into the record. A quiet murmur rose again. Even Breyer looked surprised. Judge Morrison flipped through the initial page, her face tightening. This changes the scope, the judge said softly, then louder. Given this development, I am formally referring the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for oversight. This will now fall under federal jurisdiction for the remainder of proceedings. Cole looked stunned. The courtroom had already felt too big for him. Now it felt like it was collapsing. Simone didn't gloat. She just stepped back, letting the consequences fall where they needed to. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up. Cold, sharp. She paused at the top of the stairs and pulled her coat tighter. In her bag was a photo of her and Marcus from when they were kids. It wasn't there for sentiment. It was there to remind her why she couldn't stop. Not this time. The courtroom took a recess. Simone stayed behind talking with federal agents. Reporters buzzed around the hallway like hornets. Throwing out questions no one was ready to answer. Cole slipped out the side door and walked to his cruiser. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to listen. He just wanted the silence to explain something he couldn't name. He climbed into the front seat, shut the door, and sat there a moment, hands on the wheel, not moving. Then, almost without thinking, he tapped the screen on his dash and pulled up the body cam footage from the arrest. He'd watched it once before, but not like this. The video started. There she was, Simone Harper. Calm, composed, not resisting, not raising her voice. She handed him the license before he even asked. She asked polite questions. She never shouted. He watched himself, saw his own jaw tighten. He heard his own voice clipped, commanding, suspicious. Step out of the vehicle. Am I under arrest? Yes. No warning, no explanation. Just a decision already made. He watched as he yanked open the door. Watched as she stepped out, standing tall despite the cuffs. Watched how she looked at him like she was trying to see something he wasn't showing. And how he never looked back. The clip ended. The silence returned, but this time it felt heavier than before. He stared at the screen for a long time. The knock on his window startled him. Vega. She opened the passenger door and slid in, watching him carefully. You okay? He didn't answer. She glanced at the paused footage still glowing on the dash. You rewatching it? He nodded slowly. Vega hesitated, then said something that cut deeper than anything in court had. Do you even see her as human that day? The question hit like a slap. Cole blinked. He rubbed his face with both hands. I thought I was just doing my job. But were you, she pressed gently, or were you doing what you thought your job was supposed to be? He didn't know how to answer that. He looked out the windshield, saw people crossing the courthouse steps, protest signs, microphones, conversations about justice, all swirling around a case he thought would be over in 10 minutes. Vega's voice softened. She didn't yell, didn't fight. You put her in cuffs anyway. He nodded barely. I didn't think, he said quietly. I just assumed. It was the first honest thing he'd said all day. There was no big moment, no tears, just a quiet crack in the armor. Small but real. Vega looked at him with something between pity and challenge. You want to fix this? She asked. Cole looked at her and for once didn't pretend he knew what that meant. I don't know how, he said. Start with not lying to yourself, she replied. Outside, a few reporters spotted them and raised their cameras. Vega turned away from the window. You ready to go back in? She asked. Cole sat there a beat longer. Then finally he nodded. But this time he wasn't walking back in as the officer who thought he knew it all. He was walking back in as someone who for the first time wasn't so sure. The courtroom was silent, not tense, not charged, just still. Simone stood at the front, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The strength came from somewhere quieter, the kind of strength that's been earned, not declared. She looked at the judge, then to the gallery behind her. A room filled with faces, some skeptical, some stunned, some with tears in their eyes. And she began. This was never about revenge, not for me. I've stood in courtrooms long enough to know that revenge and justice rarely walk together. She paused, swallowed. Not from nerves, but to hold back something deeper. This isn't about me winning. It's about stopping others from losing in silence. Because for every Simone Harper who gets to speak up, there are dozens who never get the chance, pulled over, dismissed, disrespected, and forgotten. This case was never just about a traffic stop. It was about a pattern, a mindset, a system. She turned just slightly, locking eyes with Cole, who sat motionless, his hands folded, gaze lowered. And for a brief second, there was no hate in her eyes, no triumph, only a quiet sort of grief. You didn't just misjudge me, Officer Matthews. You misjudged the seat you were sitting in. Power isn't the badge, it's what you do with it. The judge leaned forward. Thank you, Ms. Harper. She turned to Cole. Officer Matthews, do you wish to respond? He stood slowly, awkwardly, like he wasn't sure how to carry his own weight anymore. His voice was rough, uncertain. I don't know if anything I say now matters, he began. I thought I was doing my job. I see now. I wasn't even close. He looked at Simone. I'm sorry. And not just for what I did to you. No applause, no gavel bang, just breath being held. The judge finally looked down at her bench. After a pause that felt like it belonged in a different world, she spoke. This court finds that the arrest of Ms. Harper was unjustified. Officer Matthews is hereby suspended pending full departmental review. Furthermore, this court formally recommends immediate internal reforms within the Ash Grove Police Department, including but not limited to comprehensive anti-bias training and civilian oversight procedures. A ripple went through the courtroom, not a cheer but a release. A held breath finally exhaled. Then the judge added almost softly, the law exists for all, not just the loudest, not just the whitest. The words hung in the air like truth finally spoken aloud. Simone bowed her head slightly, not in triumph but in quiet recognition. She didn't smile. She didn't raise her arms. She simply gathered her papers, turned toward the gallery, and stepped down. People stood, some out of respect, some out of something they couldn't name. Reporters waited outside the courthouse doors, but Simone walked past them. She didn't need to speak to the cameras. Today wasn't about going viral. It was about making sure the silence didn't win. There were no flashing cameras the next morning, no victory speeches, no television crews waiting outside her door. Just the slow creak of her office chair, the soft shuffle of paper, and the faint ticking of the wall clock in Simone Harper's quiet office. The world had already moved on. She hadn't. Simone sat in her usual seat, still dressed in the same gray slacks and navy blouse from the night before. Her coffee was cold, her inbox full, but none of it felt urgent. She wasn't tired, not in the way exhaustion drains the body, but in the way only clarity can wear a person down. The kind that comes after you've spoken your truth and watched it echo in rooms you weren't supposed to stand in. She glanced at her calendar. Back to court next Monday. Another case, another fight. That was the reality of her work. Justice wasn't a mic drop moment. It wasn't applause or headlines. It was persistence, paperwork, long nights with no one watching. Then just as she was reaching for a new file, she noticed something out of place. A plain white envelope, no stamp, no name. It sat half hidden beneath a stack of folders like it had been slipped there quietly. Simone frowned, picked it up, and turned it over in her hand. The handwriting on the front was shaky, uneven, hesitant. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. Simone, you didn't just hold me accountable, you made me see. I used to think doing my job meant enforcing the rules. But the truth is I never really questioned who made the rules or why I enforced them the way I did. Watching the footage, hearing you speak, I didn't recognize myself. That scared me. I'm not writing for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know your words didn't fall flat. They stayed with me. I'm starting anti-bias training next week. On my own. I'm meeting with a community group downtown. It's not redemption, but it's a start. Cole Matthews. Simone read it once. Then again, she didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't react the way people might expect. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and slid it into the drawer on her right. Not because it needed to be saved, not because she planned to read it again, but because it mattered that someone had taken the time, even if he was part of the problem, even if it had come too late. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes lingering on the edge of the desk. The hum of the city outside was constant sirens in the distance, footsteps on the pavement, the buzz of life resuming. And yet in here, everything was still. Her phone lit up with a new voicemail, another request for an interview. She ignored it. She had no interest in being a symbol. No need to stand behind podiums or trend online. Let others tell stories about heroes. She knew better. Justice isn't a spotlight. It's not a headline. It's a choice made quietly day after day. It's the file you don't ignore, the email you send the wrong you refuse to let pass. Simone reached for a new case folder, straightened her posture, picked up her pen, and began again. Because justice wasn't something you won once and walked away from. It was something you lived. And while most people would never know her name, the people who needed her, they would remember. And that was enough. The seasons had shifted twice since the courtroom fell silent. The city moved on as cities always do, but something small had changed beneath the surface. It didn't happen with banners or breaking news. No parades, no speeches carved into granite. Just people, real imperfect people, choosing to walk a different path. On a gray Wednesday morning, Officer Cole Matthews stood in front of a semicircle of folding chairs at the Westside Community Center. He wasn't in uniform anymore. He wore a soft blue button-down sleeves, rolled up face a little more lined than the year before. The people sitting across from him were men and women who didn't trust cops. Some had stories that matched Simone's. Some had stories that hurt even more. Cole cleared his throat, adjusted the mic, and began. Before we talk about policy or law, let's talk about assumptions. The kind that sit in your gut so long you forget they're there. I used to think I was just doing my job, until someone held up a mirror and I didn't like who I saw. He didn't mention Simone by name. He never did. But in every session he taught, her voice echoed between the lines. It shaped his words, held him accountable even now. Across the city, in a glass-paneled auditorium flooded with morning light, Simone Harper stepped up to a wide wooden podium. The Reform Now National Conference had gathered legal experts, judges, students, and community leaders from across the country. Her face was calm. Her notes were tucked away untouched. She didn't need them. We talk about justice as if it's a verdict, a finish line. But what if it's a direction, a practice, something we have to choose again every single day? The room was silent, not in tension, but in attention. She continued, "A year ago, I stood in a courtroom not just to defend myself, but to confront a system I've spent my whole life inside. That confrontation didn't end with a ruling. It started a question. How much are we willing to change, and how much are we willing to lose to make sure the law protects everyone equally?" She didn't tell them everything. Not about the letter, not about the quiet way as she went back to work. But she didn't need to. Her presence was its own testimony, her resilience the case study. Back on the west side, Cole was finishing his session. One man in the back, maybe in his 40s, raised his hand. "So what now, officer? You teach this class and everything's fixed." Cole shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Nothing's fixed. But it's harder to walk the same path once you know where it leads. And it's harder to stay silent once someone's shown you the cost." He let the silence settle before nodding toward the exit. But the point isn't perfection. It's that we don't stop trying. He collected the handouts, packed his bag, and walked out under a pale afternoon sun. Elsewhere, Simone stepped away from the podium. A young woman approached her, a law student, nervous and eager eyes bright with questions. Simone listened, smiled, offered a few gentle words, and moved on. There was more work to be done, always. That night across the city, Simone sat by her window watching lights blink across the skyline. She thought about the past year, the long hearings, the quiet victories, the people she couldn't help, and the ones she did. At the same time, Cole stood before a mural freshly painted on the side of the precinct he once called home. It showed a winding road, jagged and steep, flanked by faces of all colors, all ages, all walks of life. No badges, no uniforms, just people. At the center, someone had painted a single phrase, "Justice doesn't shout, it listens." Cole traced the edge of one letter with his finger, then stepped back and let it be. They didn't see each other again. They didn't need to. Because somewhere in the same city, under the same sky, two people who once stood on opposite sides of a courtroom had chosen the same direction. Not because it was easy, but because someone had to. And maybe, just maybe, that's how change really begins. Not with the loudest voice, not with applause, but with a quiet choice. A decision to walk, to keep walking, even when no one is watching. Voiceover soft and steady. Justice isn't a destination. It's a direction. And they're both still walking. If this story moved you even just a little, take a moment to let it sit with you. Because Simone's journey isn't just about one woman standing up in court. It's about what happens when we refuse to stay silent, when we choose courage over comfort, and when justice becomes something we live, not just something we wait for. If you believe stories like this matter, stories that dig deeper, ask harder questions, and remind us what humanity really looks like, then please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful, heartfelt tales like this one. Every comment, every view, every bit of support means the world to us. It helps our small team keep creating stories that challenge, inspire, and bring people together, one voice at a time. Thanks for walking this journey with us. And remember, justice isn't always loud, but it always matters. She stood for justice until a white cop punched her in open court, thinking he could silence her with one blow. But Judge Naomi didn't just stand back up. She set out to expose the entire system that had protected him for years. Can one woman's refusal to fall bring down decades of corruption? If stories like this move you, leave a comment and share where you are watching from. We want to hear your voice too. Now let's take you inside the courtroom where it all began. The morning in Crestwood was already warm, the kind of southern warmth that clung to your skin before the sun fully settled in. Outside the county courthouse, the white columns glowed soft against the haze, but inside, courtroom 4 felt colder than it should have. Judge Naomi Pierce stepped through the side door precisely at 8:45 a.m. Her robe moved silently as she walked. Her posture was upright, her hands calm. She had presided over hundreds of hearings before, but something in the air this morning, something just beneath the quiet, felt heavier. Across the room sat Officer Travis Kincaid. He didn't fidget. He didn't look away. He leaned back, one leg crossed over the other, a polished silver pen twirling between two fingers, not out of need but out of habit. Or maybe intention. He wasn't dressed like someone under pressure. No jacket, crisp white shirt, top button undone. It was subtle, but it said enough. I'm comfortable here. He gave a small nod to someone in the back, an officer maybe, then let his eyes drift lazily around the courtroom until they met Naomi's. She didn't look away. Kincaid had been involved in multiple use-of-force complaints, at least 2 with racial overtones, one involving a teenager and a cracked jaw. None of the cases had made it far. Video footage disappeared, testimonies blurred, supervisors used phrases like lack of context. But this time the video had gone public before anyone could stop it. A grainy clip from a gas station camera. A teenager unarmed stepping back. Then a flash of movement. Then blood. The sound was muted, but the fury it sparked wasn't. This wasn't a criminal trial. There would be no jail time. Just a civil suit brought by a mother who refused to stay silent. The court couldn't take Kincaid's badge, but it could take something else, the illusion that nothing had happened. Naomi opened the file, scanned the summary, then looked up again. Kincaid was still watching her. His smile wasn't wide, but it lingered just long enough to make the air feel thinner. The press sat 2 rows back. A few activists took seats near the aisle. Court clerks whispered quietly. Even the bailiff seemed to stand a little stiffer than usual. Naomi's fingers rested on the edge of the bench. She remembered once, as a child, watching her father step out of a police car, bruised and silent. He hadn't said a word, just sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for 2 hours. She never asked him what happened. He never offered. That silence had stayed with her. Now, years later, she was sitting higher up, but the silence hadn't gone away. It just changed shape. She leaned slightly forward. Court is now in session, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The plaintiff's attorney stood. Papers rustled. The room shifted. Somewhere near the window, a breeze moved the edge of a curtain, just barely. Kincaid didn't move. He just smiled again. The kind of smile that made you feel like you were playing a part in a script he'd already read. And in his version, the ending never changed. Naomi didn't respond. She had learned long ago that the power of a courtroom didn't come from who shouted the loudest. It came from who stayed standing when the room turned quiet. She looked back at the file. This trial wouldn't break the system, she thought, but maybe it would show the cracks. The morning moved forward in careful steps. Testimonies were read, objections raised, then overruled. The plaintiff's attorney guided the room through a series of images, frames frozen from the surveillance video. In one, the boy's hands were raised. In another, he was on the ground. The room stayed quiet. Naomi listened without shifting. Her hands stayed folded. Her pen never moved, but her eyes caught everything. Across the room, Kincaid had grown restless. He shifted in his chair. He whispered something to his attorney, then leaned back again. His foot tapped the floor once, then again. He wasn't smiling anymore. The plaintiff's attorney paused mid-sentence, asking to play the video aloud. The room adjusted, the lights dimmed slightly. A screen flickered on behind the bench. Naomi nodded. A moment later, the room filled with static, and the grainy clip began to play. There was the boy, barely older than 17, standing near a gas station display, looking over his shoulder. Then, without warning, a blur of motion. A fist. A fall. The sound of impact, even muffled, echoed with something that wasn't just violence. It was routine. Familiar. Naomi looked ahead, not at the screen, but past it. She didn't see the punch this time. She remembered a different one decades ago landed on someone who hadn't even raised his voice. Then it happened. Without warning, a chair scraped sharply, papers fell, and suddenly Officer Kincaid had crossed the space between them. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't hesitate. His fist landed just beneath her eye, hard, fast, unfiltered. Gasps erupted. The courtroom stood still for a breath too long. The sound of flesh meeting a bone echoed louder than the video cue ever could. Her chair tilted slightly. Her glasses hit the floor. But Naomi didn't fall. She gripped the edge of the bench with one hand, steadying herself. Her head turned back toward him, slowly, blood running in a thin, bright line along her cheek. The room hadn't caught up yet. Two bailiffs rushed forward, their radios crackling, hands grabbing at Kincaid's arms. He resisted for a second violently, but was quickly pinned down, his knees buckling under pressure. His voice rang out raw and cracked. "She ain't no judge. She ain't no one to me." The courtroom was chaos. A woman screamed in the back row. One of the court officers swore as he tried to restrain Kincaid. A camera near the ceiling rotated slightly, still rolling. Naomi stood straight again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wipe the blood. Her eyes remained fixed on Kincaid as if he were still in front of her. Not the version now on the floor shouting and struggling, but the man he had been a minute earlier, convinced of his untouchability. She looked to the bailiff and spoke each word shaped carefully. "Hold him." Then her voice dropped softer, steadier. "Don't turn off the camera." The bailiff nodded, his face pale. Naomi placed her hands flat on the bench. Blood from her cheek touched the polished wood. It left a mark, thin, curved red against dark grain. Nobody moved to clean it. The courtroom had seen raised voices before. It had heard lies, truths, oaths taken with trembling hands. But this, the act, the blood, the refusal to fall, felt different. The press captured it all. Flashing light from a camera clicked near the floor. Somewhere a journalist whispered into a recorder. Another scribbled notes without looking up. Kincaid kept shouting. His voice broke between words. "She's not law. She don't get to sit above me." Naomi didn't answer. She looked at the table where her glasses had fallen. Bent, one lens cracked. She didn't reach for them. Instead, she took a breath and slowly, quietly sat back down. The courtroom didn't speak. It watched the blood dry into a line that curved across the bench. Watched the woman in black robes hold the space without rage, without collapse. Justice wasn't clean anymore, but it was still standing. By mid-afternoon, the clip had already gone viral. It started as a shaky 30-second phone video posted by someone in the back row. Then came the courtroom footage, clean, fixed angle, high quality. Two different views of the same punch. One chaos, one silence. The hashtags appeared fast. Naomi did not fall. Nashvaz justice still standing. She held the line. Some called her brave. Some called her reckless. Most couldn't look away. On one network, a commentator raised his brow and asked how a judge could maintain credibility after allowing herself to be struck on the bench. On another, a panel of activists replayed the clip 3 times in a row, calling Naomi the spine of the modern justice movement. Even late-night shows picked it up, one host dubbing the moment the slap the system didn't see coming. The noise swelled beyond the courthouse. By morning, the governor's office had received over 12,000 calls. Civil rights groups issued statements. A local pastor compared her to Rosa Parks. And deep in the state capitol, someone started to worry. At 9:02 a.m., a memo arrived in Naomi's inbox. It was brief. No seal, no direct order, just a confidential suggestion from a state senator's office worded with care, for her safety, for the court's integrity, for the greater good. They asked her to take a temporary leave. She read it once, then closed the email. She returned to her chambers without a word. Later that morning, when courtroom 4 opened its doors, Naomi was already seated. No makeup, no fanfare, just the same quiet strength, the same black robe. The bruise under her eye was visible but not hidden. The courtroom filled quickly. Cameras pointed but didn't flash. Reporters whispered but didn't shout. She looked across the room, not for the first time, and saw people waiting, not for her verdict, but for her presence. The next case was unrelated, a zoning dispute between 2 local businesses. But it didn't matter. Her return was the message. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Naomi Pierce presiding. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and the room exhaled. But even as she spoke, her voice calm, clipped, deliberate, another voice rose inside her. A voice that belonged to a man who had once stood just like she did, but on the other side of justice. Her father, Isaiah Pierce, had been arrested in the summer of 1996. It was a hot night. He had been walking home from work, still in his security guard uniform, when a patrol car pulled up. They asked him where he was going. He answered. They asked again. Then they told him to lie on the ground. He didn't fight, but he didn't move fast enough. The arrest report later mentioned non-compliance. The hospital form listed a fractured wrist and a bruised spine. Naomi was 13. She remembered sitting in the hallway outside the ER watching nurses pass with clipboards. She remembered her mother pacing. She remembered her father's eyes when he finally emerged, tired, dimmed, and more silent than she had ever seen them. That silence had shaped something inside her. Not rage, not even fear, just a quiet promise. You don't change a system by shouting at it. You change it by making it look at you and not look away. And now all these years later, she was still making them look, even through a bruise, even through blood, even through the polite threats tucked into state memos. Naomi reached for her gavel. She tapped it once. Next case, she said. The sound echoed across the wood. It wasn't loud, but it landed where it needed to. The office of District Attorney Eric Langston hadn't changed much over the years. Same worn leather chairs, same framed law degree, slightly tilted on the wall. Same faint smell of brewed coffee and old books. But something in the air had shifted, something Naomi could feel before the door even closed behind her. Eric stood as she entered. Naomi, he said, his voice neutral. Thanks for coming. She nodded once, taking the seat across from his desk. There was a time she would have joked about the creaky chair. Today she said nothing. He didn't either, not at first. He shuffled some papers, adjusted his pen, looked past her out the window, then back at his hands. I watched the footage, he said finally. All of it. Naomi didn't reply. He continued cautiously. You handled it with restraint, more than most would have. She waited. He wasn't done. But the situation's tense. A lot of moving parts. Politically, well, you know how things get. Naomi tilted her head slightly. I know exactly how they get. He looked down, smiled, but not with warmth. There are calls for review. Internal Affairs is involved now. The city council's asking questions. The governor's office, too. It's not just about Kincaid anymore. It's about the department, the optics, the precedent. He didn't say it's about you, but she heard it anyway. She folded her hands. So you're saying they're circling? He looked at her, then looked away. I'm saying this might be a good time to let things settle. The pause was long, but not heavy, just tired. They had worked cases together once. Protest shootings, wrongful stops, juvenile justice reforms. They'd shared takeout on courthouse steps. Shared grief when verdicts fell the wrong way. But now his tone was lined with diplomacy. His words carefully padded with conditional phrases. She stood. Thanks for the coffee, Eric. He rose too. Naomi. She didn't stop walking. Out in the hallway, the walls felt tighter than before. The marble didn't echo as much as it used to. Or maybe she was just walking softer. Eric closed the door behind her slowly. Inside, he sat down again, rubbed his forehead, reached for his phone. A message blinked at the top of the screen. No name, no number. Just 5 words. If she pushes release 20. He stared at it for a long moment, then locked the screen and slid the phone face down on the desk. The silence in the room didn't comfort him. Naomi drove home without music. She didn't cry. She didn't curse. She just listened to the hum of the tires and the clicking of the turn signals. The city passed by her window in steady frames, graffiti traffic lights, a bus full of middle schoolers. She'd known Eric too long to be surprised. But disappointment wasn't always about surprise. Sometimes it was just about the weight of seeing a familiar face retreat when the fire got too close. When she pulled into her driveway, the sun was low, the sky dimming into the kind of orange that reminded her of Sunday evenings as a girl when her father would sit on the porch and say nothing for hours. Inside, she dropped her bag by the door and sat at the kitchen table. No news, no messages, just her. She stared at the blank wall across from her. She'd walked alone before, she would do it again. But this time felt colder. Not because of the blow, not because of the cameras, but because somewhere someone had decided to weaponize a year. 2019. She didn't know what the message to Eric meant, not exactly. But she could guess. She had made hard choices that year. Choices she did not regret, but that others might twist. That they would twist. Still, she hadn't come this far to step backward now. She stood again, poured herself a glass of water, and let the silence settle around her, not as surrender, but as preparation. 2 days after the incident, Naomi made a simple request. She filled out the formal form, signed her name, and handed it to the tech office clerk. Without comment, request for full security footage. Courtroom 4, March 8th, 0830 U930. She'd done it dozens of times before. Nobody flinched. But 3 hours later, the response came back short and sanitized. Due to a technical failure, the primary courtroom feed was interrupted from 0846 to 8:52 a.m. Secondary backup failed to initiate. IT systems admin. The room had more than one camera, more than one feed, more than one failsafe. And yet all of them failed for exactly 6 minutes. The 6 minutes that mattered most. Naomi read the email twice. She didn't frown, didn't sigh. She just closed the tab. That afternoon, Lena Cho knocked gently on her door. She was the youngest clerk on the team, mid-20s, sharp eyes, soft voice. Grew up in Oakland, studied at Howard, interned at the ACLU. The kind of quiet fire that didn't draw attention, but never went out. Naomi looked up. Yes, Lena. Lena stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Her hands were clasped tightly. I was reviewing the metadata log, she said. Just routine, but she hesitated. Naomi waited. The cameras didn't fail, Lena said. At least not on their own. Someone executed a remote command override at 08:45. Exactly when the incident started. Naomi's eyes didn't widen. She simply nodded once as if confirming a suspicion she had already lived with for years. Lena glanced toward the hallway, then back. I didn't copy anything yet, she said. But if I did, if I were to extract the raw system mirror onto a personal drive, hypothetically, it would be from Terminal 2. The internal failsafe logs still exist for 48 hours. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, if you were to keep that copy safe, I would advise you to label it as birthday photos. Lena blinked, then gave the faintest smile. I'll name the folder Auntie's 70th. Naomi let her hand rest on the table. Lena, I'm not asking you to break protocol. I know. I'm not asking you to choose sides. I already did. There was a pause. Then Lena lowered her voice further. If we have the original file, what happens next? Naomi didn't answer immediately. She glanced toward the window, sunlight pooling at the edge of the curtains. Then she said slowly, when the law loses its light, we don't stop looking for justice. But we carry a smaller flame of our own. Quiet, careful, but alive. But Lena stood straight. There was no victory in her expression, only resolve. She turned to go, then paused at the door. Judge Pierce, she said, they're watching everything now. Naomi nodded. So are we. After Lena left, Naomi leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes. She had known, the moment the punch landed, the moment she stood up and said, keep the camera on. She had known someone would try to erase that moment, not because of the violence systems had covered worse, but because she hadn't fallen. That was the part they couldn't let survive. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, worn edges, a red tab labeled IS-96. Inside, photos reports a decades-old arrest form with her father's name typed in faded ink. They had buried that file once too, but this time someone had already made a copy, and someone else had learned how to carry a fire. It was just after 10 p.m. when Lena sent the message. Subject line found something. Attachment 1 zip-on folder. Password protected. Titled Records Recovered 14A. Naomi read it in her kitchen, barefoot, glass of water, sweating quietly in her hand. Inside the file were internal emails. Dozens. All bearing government domains timestamped within the past 72 hours. Each one a thread in a web that was no longer hidden, just quietly organized. The first chain was between D.A. Langston and the police chief's office. The tone was polished, professional. But buried between scheduling and procedural updates was a single undeniable sentence. If she pushes, we can't just sit back. Drop Pierce 2019, it's public record. Let the press interpret it. Another thread revealed a forwarded memo from a political strategist. Attached were media narrative options, polling reactions, and one chilling suggestion. Leverage existing incidents to erode her public credibility without directly engaging the footage. The last email Lena had highlighted came from a private account, but the footer still bore the name Raymond Chalmers, Chalmers Foundation for Civic Order donor, State Judicial Reform PAC. Short and precise, the message read, I've spoken with the governor's team. If this judge becomes a symbol, we all lose control of the story. Time to act. Naomi closed the folder. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass of the kitchen window, still unreadable. She had known this wasn't just about a punch, but now she had names, structure, strategy. The machine wasn't improvising, it was following protocol. And someone like Raymond Chalmers didn't send emails unless he was already 5 moves ahead. He wasn't a household name. He didn't need to be. His face rarely showed up in campaign photos, but his checks did. He was known to fund law and order candidates, appear at unity galas, and host private dinners in homes so large their zip codes had gates. Kincaid had attended one such dinner. So had Langston. So had half the judges in the state's Southern Circuit. Naomi hadn't. She remembered the invitation, glossy cardstock, serif font, RSVP, by courier. She'd never replied. Now she knew that silence had been noted. She sat down slowly at the table. The file labeled Pierce 2019 was already open in her mind. She didn't need to read it again to recall what it said. 3 years ago, a sentencing decision she made in a probation violation case had drawn quiet backlash. The defendant was a white woman from a politically connected family. Naomi had chosen jail time after 3 failed rehabilitative programs. The outcry wasn't public, but emails were exchanged, meetings held. At the time, she'd called it justice. Now it was ammunition. She looked up as Lena entered, quiet, hesitant. "I didn't mean to dig that deep," Lena said. "I was just trying to cross-check metadata." And the names started repeating. Naomi didn't speak right away. She watched Lena's face, the nervous energy behind her words, the subtle weight of realizing something bigger than either of them had just been touched. "You were smart to stop there," Naomi said. "I didn't copy anything else," Lena added quickly. Naomi nodded. "Good, that's not your burden to carry." Lena hesitated. "But it's yours." Naomi met her eyes. "Yes," she said, "it's mine." Silence settled like dusk between them. Then Naomi added softly, "Chalmers is scared. Not of what I'll say, but of what people will believe if I'm not silenced first." Lena clenched her jaw. "What are you going to do?" Naomi didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to the side wall of her kitchen, where a single framed photo hung her father Isaiah at the 1997 hearing where all charges against him were dropped, his hand resting on her shoulder. Her 13-year-old self looking up at him, not with pride, but with permission. To speak, to stand, to continue. Naomi drew in a breath. "Tomorrow," she said, "I don't speak in court. I speak outside of it." Lena looked confused. "A press conference?" "No," Naomi said. "Something smaller, something harder to spin." She stood. "We're going to let them know the story is already being written, and not by them." The envelope was unmarked. No return address. No stamp. Just her name, Naomi, scrawled in uneven handwriting. It was waiting in her mailbox when she got home, nestled between junk flyers and a utility bill. She opened it, standing by the front door, keys still in hand. Inside, a single photograph. Her daughter Eliza standing at the gate of her elementary school, ponytail swaying, backpack sliding off one shoulder, smiling at something off camera. Below the image in red ink, beautiful, just like her mother. Naomi didn't scream. She didn't throw the photo or call the police. She simply walked to the kitchen, placed the envelope on the table, and sat down. The glass of water from earlier was still half full. She stared at it, then stared through it. And somewhere between the kitchen clock's tick and the settling silence, she broke. The tears came quietly, at first slow, steady. Then all at once, her hand pressed to her mouth, her shoulders hunched forward. For the first time in this entire story, the woman who hadn't flinched from fists or headlines or political betrayal finally let go. No one was there to see it. No audience, no camera, just the echo of fear that no courtroom could silence. Her phone buzzed minutes later. A message from her sister. "We picked up Eliza from school. She's safe. She's playing with the twins." Naomi replied with a single heart emoji, but her hand trembled long after she hit send. That night, Eliza sat across from her at the dinner table, a half-eaten grilled cheese sandwich between them. The girl picked at the crust. Then, without looking up, she asked, "If I see something wrong, but no one else says anything, should I stay quiet?" Naomi blinked. Her throat tightened. There were 100 possible answers, a lesson, a metaphor, a quote from some civil rights hero. But none of them came. Instead, she stood, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around her daughter, held her like she had the night Eliza was born, small and warm and impossibly still. "I don't know," she whispered into the girl's hair, "but I hope you'll be braver than I am." Eliza leaned into her without a word. That night, after the dishes were done and Eliza had fallen asleep with her stuffed elephant curled against her chest, Naomi returned to her study. She didn't turn on the light. The moonlight was enough. She stood in front of the wall behind her desk, bare beige, quietly waiting. And then slowly, deliberately, she picked up a piece of chalk from the drawer. She wrote in big, uneven strokes across the center, "I will not step back." She stared at it for a long time, then wrote one more word underneath. "Mom." No signature, no flourish. Just the truth hung on a wall like a flag. Not for others to see, for herself. A reminder, a vow. And somewhere beyond that silent room in the gears of a city, pretending not to watch a system, flinched just a little. Because they hadn't broken her. Not yet. The archives room in Fulton County Courthouse wasn't built for comfort. The lights buzzed overhead. The shelves smelled faintly of dust and paper cuts. And the silence, thick as cotton, settled over everything like regret. Naomi had been here before. But not like this. She moved through the shelves slowly, her fingertips grazing years of redacted sorrow and forgotten names. She wasn't looking for Kincaid, not directly. She was looking for 2002, the year her father, Isaiah Pierce, stopped walking straight. She remembered the change. He hadn't talked about it, not really, just said he had slipped near the sidewalk outside the store, that his knees were bad, that it was nothing. But he had flinched when sirens passed. And once, when Eliza was 3, she asked him why he never wore shorts like other grandpas. He had just smiled and changed the subject. Now, 20 years later, Naomi found it. Case ID 021647OPD, filed March 19, 2002. Complainant Isaiah Pierce. Status dismissed. Reason, a lack of corroborating evidence. Accused officer in training, Travis Kincaid. The words blurred for a second, then settled. The report was brief, clinical, a traffic stop. Alleged aggressive takedown. No body cam policy hadn't required it yet. No witnesses, no disciplinary follow-up. But Naomi read between the lines. Her father had been forced to kneel on the side of a patrol car. The scar behind his left knee, he always said it was from construction work. It hadn't been. And now 2 decades later, the man who had pushed her father down in silence had punched her in public. Same fist, same intent. Naomi stood in the quiet for a long time, then carefully took a photocopy of the file and slipped it into her case folder. That evening, the house was silent. Eliza had gone to her cousin's for a sleepover. Lena was working remotely on metadata restoration, and Naomi was alone in her study the way she had always done her deepest thinking. On the shelf above her desk sat a framed photo of her father. He was younger in it, barely 40, mustache, thick eyes, proud. It had been taken the day she graduated from law school. He hadn't said much that day, just gripped her shoulder and nodded like he'd known she would do this all along. Naomi picked up the photo and brought it to her desk. She cleared everything off. Then from the top drawer, she retrieved a small velvet box. Inside her oath badge. It was polished metal, worn slightly at the edges. On the back, she had engraved it herself the night she received it. For him, for us, for what comes next. She placed the badge at the center of the desk, then placed her father's photo beside it. And then she whispered, not with rage, not with sorrow, but with something deeper, something earned. You didn't get to see it last time, but I swear, Dad, this time you'll witness justice with your own eyes. Her fingers curled slightly over the badge. It wasn't just symbolic anymore. It was a promise. Later that night, Naomi opened her laptop. She uploaded the 2002 file, paired it with the footage Lena had recovered, and saved it to 3 encrypted folders. She titled them Truth 1 for Eliza Isaiah Watches. No press yet, no statement, no reveal. But the story had started bleeding, and this time it would not clot quietly. The courtroom wasn't full. It was overflowing. Every seat taken. Reporters wedged shoulder to shoulder in the press box. 3 cameras perched on tripods in the back row, their little red lights blinking like heartbeats. One belonged to a national broadcast. The others streamed live to tens of thousands across the state. Judge Naomi Pierce sat in her robe, hands folded. Her voice when she spoke was calm, unhurried, surgical. This is a public evidentiary hearing, convened under Section 1214 of the Judicial Oversight Statute. All witnesses are under oath. Proceedings are being recorded and streamed for public transparency. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight at Eric Langston. The district attorney had aged a decade in the past week. His once trimmed tie was slightly askew. The circles under his eyes weren't concealed by powder. But he sat upright at the witness table. He still thought he could spin this. Until Naomi opened the folder and read the first subject line aloud. March 3rd, 2021. R.E. Kincaid assault footage suppression. The room shifted. Eric's throat moved, but no sound came. Naomi didn't blink. Would you like to explain this email? Eric hesitated. His eyes darted toward the back, toward the gallery. No one moved. Then he leaned forward, and the spin began. Well, Your Honor, internal investigations often involve discretion, especially when certain footage lacks full context. Naomi cut him off. Footage showing a civilian struck with a baton while kneeling. She clicked a button. The screen behind her flickered. It played. No music, no narration, just raw silence broken by the thwack of violence. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Naomi turned back to Eric. Would you like to revise your answer? His hands twitched. And then the dam cracked. Yes, fine. There were multiple instances, at least 6 internal reviews. We kept them quiet. I was told to keep them quiet. Naomi's voice didn't rise. She simply asked, by whom? Eric hesitated. Then finally, the Office of State Judicial Strategy. and private advisors. Outside the courthouse, the live stream viewership jumped by 20,000. Inside, Lena Cho was sitting quietly in the second row. She tapped a button on her tablet. At that exact moment, 3 of the largest news networks in the country received an encrypted drop, complete with metadata logs, subject lines, footage, financial ties, and one name consistently appearing: Raymond Chalmers. Inside the courtroom, Naomi turned the page. "Mr. Langston, do you recognize this document?" Eric stared. It was a signed authorization, his signature, dated a full week before Naomi had been attacked. A green light for procedural immunity for Travis Kincaid. His voice cracked. "I didn't think it would come to this." Naomi looked at him for a long time, then spoke not as a judge, but as something colder, steadier. "It always comes to this, Penny. Mr. Langston, when silence becomes policy." She turned toward the court clerk. "Madam Clerk, please read into the record the subpoenas issued under seal on April 2nd. The clerk stood, her voice clear, strong. 3 subpoenas. 1 to the State Oversight Office, 1 to the Chief of Police, 1 to the Chalmers Foundation. Dated, stamped, prepared weeks ago. Naomi had planned this. Not after the punch, not in anger, but in foresight. She hadn't reacted. She'd anticipated. A blade disguised as bait. Every word of Eric's testimony was now under oath. Every file released now matched the subpoenas in place. Every denial, every delay, every closed-door decision now admissible in court. She looked once at the cameras, then looked away. Not because she was afraid, but because this was no longer her story alone. It belonged to everyone watching, to every silent archive, every dusty complaint, every name that had never made it past a clerk's desk. The courtroom was silent as Naomi rose. She didn't give a speech. She didn't declare victory. She simply said, "We proceed." The word came like the drop of a pin in a silent cathedral. Guilty, no gasps, no cheers, just stillness, heavy and quiet as if the air itself paused to acknowledge it. Judge Naomi Pierce didn't move at first. She sat perfectly upright in her chair. Eyes steady, breath measured. The gavel still rested near her, hand untouched. She didn't need to strike it. The moment had already landed like thunder in everyone's chest. Across the room, Travis Kincaid stood as the bailiff approached. His face, once so smug it could curdle milk, was now drained of expression. No resistance, no protest. Just a slow turn of the wrist as he allowed the cuffs to click into place. But even as he was led away, his eyes searched the room not for mercy, but for relevance, as if hoping someone somewhere still feared him. No one did. Naomi rose from her seat. The courtroom shifted with her people straightening, holding their breath without realizing it. She didn't smile. Instead, she removed her glasses and held them loosely in one hand. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but it carried. This verdict speaks to one act, one man, one moment caught on tape. But justice is not a moment. She looked toward the gallery, not at reporters, not at politicians, at the people. Justice, she continued, is what happens after. When the lights go off, when no one is watching, when the wounds are still fresh and the temptation to become what hurt you is loudest. Her fingers brushed the edge of the bench where she had once bled. The wood had been cleaned, sanded, polished, but she remembered, and so did everyone who had watched. Justice is not revenge. It is not the satisfaction of seeing someone fall. Justice is the quiet, brutal choice to rise and not strike back. In the far back of the room, behind 2 rows of courtroom observers, a pair of small brown eyes watched her without blinking. Eliza, Naomi's daughter, sat with her hands folded in her lap, legs barely touching the floor. Her backpack was tucked beneath the bench, her feet swinging ever so slightly. But her gaze, it was steady, grown. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not approval, not even pride, understanding. Naomi's voice faltered for just a breath. Then she turned her gaze forward and once more steadying herself. There will be more days like this. There will be more names, more silence that needs breaking. But this chair, she looked down at her seat, the one still marked in her memory by blood and stubbornness, will never forget. She lowered herself into it once again. It creaked faintly as if remembering her weight. The room began to move again, slowly, deliberately. Reporters packed up their cameras. Attorneys whispered to aides, but no one spoke loudly. The air felt like church sacred, worn and real. Naomi didn't move. She remained in that chair, her hands resting gently on the wood. Outside, the media would call it a landmark case. Some would call her a hero. Others would sneer and call it a spectacle. But she knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even justice. It was a reminder scratched into marble, whispered into wood carried in the eyes of a little girl in the back row that justice isn't about who falls. It's about who refuses to fall in return. The archive room smelled of dust and denial. Lena Cho stood still for a moment just inside the steel doorway. The air was heavy, too still, like a room that had held its breath for years. The words painted across the far wall read simply, "Do not access without clearance." But clearance had become meaningless the moment they tried to erase what happened in courtroom 3. She stepped forward, flashlight in one hand, encrypted drive in her coat pocket. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls like silent soldiers guarding secrets no one wanted remembered. She knew what she was looking for, she just didn't know how much of it existed. It took her 3 hours to realize the answer. Too much. Folders, photos, testimonies. From as far back as 2001, names that had disappeared, reports lost in system transfers, complaints rewritten or closed prematurely. Officers transferred quietly after repeated accusations, including one very familiar name, Travis Kincaid, 6 times flagged, all buried. And he wasn't alone. Lena sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by the weight of silence. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She just worked. By dawn, the data was compiled, sorted, labeled. She didn't know what Naomi would do with it, but she knew Naomi would not let it rot in shadows. 2 days later, Judge Naomi Pierce stood in her chambers holding a sealed envelope and a small USB drive. The drive contained every buried file Lena had recovered. The envelope carried something rarer, something not typed, not filed, not stamped. A handwritten letter. To the Federal Judicial Oversight Committee, "Justice," she wrote, "cannot live in sealed cabinets. The system will not cleanse itself. It does not heal on its own. It needs disruption. It needs light. It needs those who are willing to turn the key and face what has been hidden." She didn't sign it with her title. She signed it with her name and attached the drive. She walked alone to the mailbox, mailed it herself, then walked home. The cemetery was quiet that Sunday. It always was. She stood before the gravestone, one hand resting on the top edge. The marble was cool, but the sun was warm. Isaiah Pierce, 1949, 2014, still standing. Naomi didn't speak. She only reached into the cloth bag on her shoulder, pulled out the black robe she had worn on her first day as judge, the one she'd bled on, the one that had been cleaned but never felt quite the same. She folded it carefully, smoothed the creases with one hand, then laid it across the stone, like a flag over a soldier's casket. "You never asked me to fight, Papa," she whispered, "but I did, and I'm still here." She didn't cry, but she stayed there a long time. 3 months later, a student sat in a cramped dorm room, her desk cluttered with textbooks and sticky notes. The girl had glasses too big for her face and a quiet seriousness that made her seem older than 20. Her name was Clarice Dunn, first-year law, Howard University. She clicked open the video Naomi had authorized for public release. Courtroom 3, the strike, the blood, the stillness, the order, keep the camera rolling. She didn't blink through the whole video. Then she opened her notebook, wrote on the top line above all her class notes, "I know what kind of judge I want to become." She didn't mean powerful or famous. She meant unshakable. And somewhere Naomi sat on her porch, no longer wearing a robe. No title, just Naomi. Eliza curled beside her, reading quietly. The air smelled of late summer and distant jasmine. And Naomi, for the first time in months, allowed herself to smile, not because the story had ended, but because someone else had picked up the pen. They thought bruises would silence me. They thought the robe was my strength, but they misunderstood. My voice was never mine alone, and what they tried to bury will outlive them all. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice isn't always loud, but it's always worth fighting for, then take a moment to let us know. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply tell us where you were watching from. We read every word. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, stories about courage, truth, and the kind of quiet strength that changes lives, please like this video. Share it with someone you care about and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful journeys like this one. Your support means everything to our team. It's what keeps us going. And with every share, every kind word, you help us keep these stories alive. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.